The Maenads are often written off simply as mad women by historians. However, although the name Maenads literally translates as the raving ones, these women are much more than that. The Maenads are actually sacred worshippers and holy priestesses to Dionysus, the god of wine and vegetation, festivity, madness, and frenzy. Every aspect of the Maenads' appearance echoes the god they worship. They carry the thyrsus, a staff of giant fennel covered with ivy vines, also carried by Dionysus, and wore the skin of a panther, one of Dionysus's sacred animals, as Dionysus himself are often depicted riding on the back of a panther or driving a chariot drawn by a pair of the beasts. The Maenads also put a snake over their hair, as Zeus crowned his son with snakes when he let him come out of his thigh, thus making the snake another one of Dionysus's sacred animals. Since Dionysus conquered the east before he came to Greece, he recruited many of his sacred entourage among those called barbarians, or perhaps more specifically, people who were not Greeks. The Maenads worshipped Dionysus with hymns, rites, and having their souls initiated in the Bacchic revels by living a pure day-to-day life, dancing in inspired frenzy while accompanying themselves with the heavy beat of drums and performing holy purifications. As the cult of Dionysus was traditionally associated with miracles, under the influence of Dionysus himself, the Maenads were able to perform miracles, such as striking the ground with their thysus to call forth a stream of wine and scratching the earth with their fingers to obtain streams of milk. However, Dionysus also represents the dual nature of joy and suffering as well as life and death. Therefore, Dionysus's possession of his sacred women also comes with a dark side. Although under his influence the Maenads became strong enough to be able to carry heavy objects on their shoulders, and indestructible enough to be able to carry fire on their hair without being burned, they were also known for being cruel against the enemies of Dionysus. Possessed by the strength that came from their divine frenzy, the Maenads could tear apart their enemies from limb to limb. As they could not be wounded by enemy weapons, they could also fight armies and destroy great groups of highly trained soldiers by hurling the thyrsus at them. Therefore, the Maenads also served as effective soldiers to Dionysus against those who opposed the introduction of his rites. Acting like soldiers, they murdered some of the impious enemies of their beloved god, such as Pentheus and Orpheus. Although predominantly written as a group, there are some Maenads whose name are known. The Dionysica, an ancient Greek epic poem and the principal work of the Greek poet Nonnus, written in the late 4th or early 5th century, tells us mainly about Dionysus. However, Book 33 to 35 tells us the story of Calcomede, one of the Maenads. One of the Graces tells Aphrodite about the madness of Dionysus and of Moreus, son-in-law of the Indian king Dariades, who is pursuing the Maenad named Calcomede. Hearing this, Aphrodite immediately sends for Eros. In exchange for a chaplet made by Hephaestus, at Aphrodite's request, Eros agrees to cause Moreus to fall in love and be infatuated with Calcomede. Under the influence of love-sickness caused by Eros, Moreus loses interest in battle and pursues Calcomede. Fearing for her virginity, Calcomede is comforted by Thetis, who advises her to delude Moreus into thinking that she reciprocates his feeling and promises that a serpent will protect her virginity. One day, Moreus attacks the Maenads and takes some captives as a gift for Dariades, who proceeds to send them to be tortured and killed in various creative ways. As Dariades' army traps and kills the Maenads inside the city walls, Calcomede lures Moreus out of the battle by making him believe that she is in love with him. When he is about to rape her, the serpent that protects her virginity attacks and kills him. Another Maenad whose name and story is known comparatively better than her colleagues is Chorea, who followed Dionysus in his expedition against Argos. The hero Perseus massacred all the Maenads, including Chorea. However, due to her supposedly higher rank, Chorea was buried in a tomb apart from her contemporaries instead of a common grave, thus preserving her memory out of many who did not have a tomb.
In The Golden Bough, Sir James Frazer claims that the Greek philosopher Proclus, 412 to 485 AD, tells us that Dionysus was the last king of the gods appointed by Zeus. For his father set him on the kingly throne, and placed in his hand the scepter, and made him king of all the gods of the world. In his Theogony, Hesiod says, "And Semele, daughter of Cadmus, was joined with him, the god Zeus, in love, and bare him a splendid son, joyous Dionysus, a mortal woman, an immortal son, and now they both are gods." Perhaps due to his status as being the last king of the gods, Dionysus has always embodied duality. He is the son of both his immortal father Zeus and his mortal mother Semele. He presides over wine, a drink that brings both joy and sorrow to its drinkers. His association with madness puts him in the middle of both consciousness and unconsciousness.
Due to Dionysus's own power and the importance of his duality, it is fitting then that despite their powers, the Maenads themselves were not completely undefeatable, because when there is power, there is also weakness and defeat. The Maenads were imprisoned by King Lycurgus, the king of Thrace, who was also known for being fond of cutting people to pieces and decorating his gates with their extremities. When Lycurgus heard that Dionysus has entered his kingdom, he banned the cult of Dionysus and imprisoned the Maenads. Dionysus fled and took refuge in the undersea grotto of Thetis, the leader of the Nereids. The Bibliotheca of Pseudo-Apollodorus, a compilation of Greek myths and legends, dated to the 1st or 2nd century AD, says that Dionysus drove Lycurgus insane as punishment. In his madness, Lycurgus mistook his son for a trunk of ivy. Knowing that the ivy is sacred to Dionysus, Lycurgus viciously cut and pruned the ivy without realizing that he was in fact pruning away the nose, ears, fingers, and toes of his own son. Seeing this, the land of Thrace dried up in horror. Dionysus then decreed that the land would stay dry and barren as long as Lycurgus was left unpunished for his crime towards him. Therefore, the people of Thrace bound Lycurgus and threw him to man-eating horses on Mount Pangaeus. Dionysus lifted the curse after Lycurgus's death. In his Fabulae, Hyginus says that Lycurgus tried to rape his mother after drinking wine. When he discovered what he had done, he attempted to cut down the grapevines as he believed the wine to be a bad medicine. As punishment, Dionysus drove him insane, causing him to kill both his wife and his son, and threw him to the panthers on Mount Rhodope. Orpheus was the son of Oeagrus, the king of Thrace, and the muse Calliope. When Orpheus was a child, it was the god Apollo who taught him how to play the lyre. Orpheus's music had the ability to charm the animals and make the trees dance. When he was older, Orpheus took his lyre and joined the expedition of the Argonauts. He saved Jason and the Argonauts by playing his lyre to prevent them to be enchanted by the beautiful songs of the sirens. The most famous story about Orpheus is of his relationship with his wife Eurydice. Eurydice fell into a nest of vipers and was bitten to death. Orpheus found his wife's body and, in his grief, started singing the most mournful songs. His songs were mournful that even the nymphs and the gods started weeping and advised him to go to the underworld to bring his wife back. Orpheus followed their advice and met with Hades and Persephone. He pleaded with them through his songs to allow him to take wife back. The god and goddess agreed to this request. However, they told him not to look back until he and his wife had reached the surface. Orpheus and Eurydice started walking towards the surface. When Orpheus reached the opening of the cave, he looked back anxiously to see if his wife was still behind him. As Eurydice had not yet reached the surface, she disappeared back into the underworld forever. Perhaps it was also due to this that at the end of his life, Orpheus seemed to have prayed to no one else but his patron Apollo. One day, Orpheus went to pay tribute to Apollo near the oracle of Dionysus. The Maenads caught him there for being an infidel to Dionysus and tore him to pieces in a frenzy of their divine madness. Still singing, Orpheus's head floated to Lesbos, where an oracle of Orpheus was established. Apollo himself took pity on Orpheus and asked him to stop. Orpheus's dismembered limbs were then gathered up and buried by the Muses. Apollo placed Orpheus's lyre in the heavens as a constellation. In his Theogony, Hesiod tells us that Semele, the daughter of Cadmus, the king of Thebes, bore Dionysus prematurely after having an affair with Zeus. Hera, angry at her husband's betrayal, convinces Semele to see Zeus in his godly form. Zeus appears to her as a lightning bolt and kills her instantly. However, Zeus manages to save their unborn son, Dionysus. He hides the baby Dionysus from Hera by sewing the fetus up in his own thigh until Dionysus is ready to be born. A continuation of Dionysus's relationship with his mother's side of the family is found in Euripides' The Bacchae. Semele's family, particularly her sister Agave, are convinced that Semele died as a result of her blasphemous lies about the identity of her baby's father. The young god is therefore spurned by his own family. Therefore Dionysus travels throughout Asia, gathering a cult of female worshippers, the Maenads. He later returns to Thebes, his birthplace, to take revenge on the ruling house of Cadmus, his grandfather, for their refusal to worship him and to vindicate his mother. As the play begins, Dionysus has driven the women of Thebes into an ecstatic frenzy. These women include his own aunts, Agave, Autonoe, and Ino. He sends them dancing and hunting on Mount Cithaeron. Although some of the older men of the city, such as Cadmus himself and the old blind seer Tiresias, have also become enthusiastic devotees of the Bacchic rituals, the young King Pentheus, Agave's son who has recently taken over the throne from Cadmus, scolds them harshly. Pentheus then effectively bans Dionysian worship by ordering his soldiers to arrest anyone else found engaging in the rites. He sees the women's divinely caused insanity as nothing but drunken cavorting and an attempt to escape the mores and legal codes which regulates Theban society. After Dionysus allowed himself to be arrested in his disguise as the leader of the Dionysian priests, he is immediately interrogated by the skeptical Pentheus. It is soon clear from his questions that Pentheus himself is also deeply interested in the Dionysiac rites. When Dionysus, in his disguise, refuses to fully reveal the rites to him, Pentheus has him locked up. Being a god, Dionysus quickly breaks free and promptly razes Pentheus's palace to the ground in a giant earthquake and fire. A herdsman brings news for Pentheus from Mount Cithaeron that the Maenads are performing incredible feats and miracles. The guards are unable to harm them with their weapons, while the women appear to be able to defeat them with only sticks. Now Pentheus is becoming even more eager to see these ecstatic women. Wishing to humiliate and punish him, Dionysus convinces Pentheus to dress as a Maenad to avoid detection and go to the rites himself. Dionysus then takes his vengeance a step further than just humiliation by helping Pentheus up to the top of a tree for a better view of the Maenads. After seeing that Pentheus is sitting comfortably on the tree, Dionysus alerts the women to the snooper. Driven wild by this intrusion, the women pull Pentheus, who quickly realize that he is in fact trapped in the tree. The women then proceeds to rip Pentheus's body apart, piece by piece. Still possessed by the Dionysian ecstasy Agave, Pentheus's mother arrives back at the palace carrying the head of her own son, believing it to be the head of a mountain lion, which she had killed with her bare hands. She proudly displays Pentheus's severed head as a hunting trophy to her horrified father Cadmus. But as Dionysus's influence begins to wear off, Agave realizes with horror of what she has done. Plutarch's Parallel Lives, likely to have been written in the 2nd century, tells us that the Dionysiac festival was held in a 5th century BC. Temples surmounted by tripods in which each of the 10 Attic tribes participated in contests. Prizes would be awarded to the victorious by the state. The Palestinian city of Scythopolis was also connected to the worship of Dionysus. Pliny's Historia Naturalis tells us that the name Scythopolis was derived from the Scythians, who was put in that area by Dionysus himself, in order to protect the tomb of his nurse who was buried there. Cultist rites associated with worship of Dionysus were characterized by maniacal dancing to the sound of crashing cymbals and loud music. The revelers would drunkenly whirl, scream, and incite each other to greater and greater heights of ecstasy. The purpose of this rite was to achieve a state of ecstasy so high that the celebrants' souls would be temporarily freed from their earthly bodies, thus making them able to meet with Dionysus to gain a glimpse of they would someday experience in eternity. The foundation myth of Dionysus was reenacted every other year during the Agrionia, an ancient Greek religious festival in honor of Dionysus Agrionius. The women were organized into 3 dance groups and rushed off to Mount Cithaeron. The rite then reached its climax in a frenzied performance of feats of strength and madness. The worshippers would uproot trees, tearing a bull apart with their bare hands, sparagmos, and eating its flesh raw, omopagia. The second rite served as a sacrament much like a communion in which the worshipper would assume the strength and character of the god by symbolically eating the flesh and drinking the blood of his symbolic incarnation, as the bull is also an animal sacred to Dionysus. Having symbolically eaten his body and drunk his blood, the celebrants then became vessels for possession by Dionysus. The term Maenads also refers to the women who were driven mad by Dionysus because they refused to worship him. Dionysus' favored punishment method seemed to be driving these women mad and forced them to participate in horrific rites against their will. After his exploits in Thebes, Dionysus went to Argos, where all the women in the city joined in his worship except for the daughters of King Proetus. Dionysus punished them by driving them mad until they killed the infants who were nursing at their breasts. He also punished the 3 daughters of Minyas, Alcato, Leucippe, and Arcippe, who rejected Dionysus's rights to remain true to their household duties. While they were working, they were startled by the sounds of invisible drums, flutes, and cymbals. As punishment for their resistance to Dionysus, the 3 daughters of Minyas became madwomen and drew a lot to choose the child of one of their, and tearing the child to pieces, as the women on the mountain did to bulls. Despite Dionysus's cruel punishments, the average ancient women still found some affinity with the Maenads. During a war in the middle of the 3rd century BC, a group of entranced Maenads lost their way and arrived in Amphissa, a city near Delphi. There the Maenads sank down exhausted in the middle of a marketplace before being overpowered by a deep sleep. The women of Amphissa formed a protective ring around the Maenads and stayed there to protect them while they slept. When the Maenads finally awoke, the women of Amphissa arranged for them to return home safely,